to introduce our first plenary speaker, Marie Allen, who's been a friend of the CFO for a number of years now. We've worked on various little projects together. Marie was a detective with South Yorkshire Police for 30 years, working on all kinds of crimes. And in 1997, you also started to, while still working as a detective, you started training your colleagues on aspects of investigative interviewing. Yeah? And Marie is now a full-time police trainer. She's been a full-time police trainer since 2007, and her main area is police interviewing, all kinds of aspects of police interviewing. And I'm told that recently she has moved her focus to issues to do with safeguarding children in the context of police interviews. Thank you very much, Marie, for accepting our invitation to talk at the Symposium.
Pleasure.
It's great to have you here again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph. And thank you, Nikki. One or two faces I think I certainly recognise from different conferences that I've delivered to. When Nikki contacted me and asked me to come, I more than jumped at the opportunity to speak to you from the voice of the practitioner. There's a lot of academia around the investigative interviewing, but what I wanted to bring to this conference is what really happens and what police officers really face with, and what our victims really look like. So initially, I think I was going to have a slot a little bit later, and then Nikki got in touch and said, any chance you can come a bit early? They were like, good job I'm not booked a train ticket yet. Yeah, I'll definitely come. And then thinking about it afterwards, I thought, it's probably the best place for me to be. Not that I'm going to scarp her afterwards. It's just that probably sets the scene of what we're talking about when we're talking about police interviewing. And then I've looked at what everybody else is going to present afterwards, and hopefully what you'll do is you'll keep making links back to this presentation that you've seen that I've called These Feet Were Made for Talking. Well, it's a little bit of PowerPoint, not an awful lot, and then I've been very kindly being given permission by the victim to show you a real interview of a real case. It's not mocked up or anything. It is the real McCoy, and the young lady who was the victim of it, a young girl, and her parents said yes, it's okay to show it. Although I can't circulate it, I can show it. So that's how it's going to be. I'm going to give you a little bit of where we've come, where we've been, where we've come from, where we're going, and then generally what an interview looks like. Are there any police in the room? So, conduct interviews? With witnesses? Yeah, good. Any real complexities have you faced as part of doing interviews? Yeah, they are complex things. Yeah, they're not easy to do. So, just a little bit of the history about why we've got what we've got. The Memorandum of Good Practice when interviewing children came about on the back of the Cleveland inquiry, where the police and social services were highly criticised for not conducting very good quality interviews with with children. They were words were put in their mouth. It was confirmatory bias. They were getting children just to agree by saying yes, and children were being put in care. Children's homes and foster care on the back of what looked like that they were all victims of child abuse. An excessive amount of children. We were running out of places where to put these children. Parents were screaming at the police doors and at their local MPs saying, this can't be right, our child is not a victim of abuse. It wasn't really until it grew out of all proportion that it started to be looked at as to what's happening. The upshot of all that, if you want to go on about it, is that some of those children were victims of abuse. Have they been taken away from them? their parents and looked like they were going to be in long-term foster care. That brought about the Home Office research, and it was called Action for Justice. What it looked at initially is how do we gather children's evidence? We can't do it by a statement, which is what we used to do back in the 70s, which seems pretty bizarre in the 21st century, that would sit down with a very young child of 5 and ask questions and write their answer, when in reality they weren't giving those answers, it was probably their parents and their carers. That memorandum held good for a long time. But eventually the question was asked, and it was asked, and it went to the Home Office, why is it only for children? Why is it only children who've got a right to have their voice heard by being a trained person conducting that interview, who's not leading, who's not putting words in their mouth, and that video can be then put into a courtroom arena, and it will be listened to as if it's their evidence in chief. It is actually their evidence. Why is it only children? Because we've got people with learning difficulties, we've got people who wouldn't stand the rigour of being able to walk into a courtroom and give their evidence, never mind being cross-examined. So that's what the Home Office research was looking at. But what can we do to expand this this ability to get vulnerable people's voice into a courtroom? That became a report, the Speaking Up for Justice report, in 1998. It was put forward as, yes, we can. We could open up what we do for children, we could open it up to a much wider arena, and we could offer it to adults as well. So adults who wouldn't be able to, because of communication issues, wouldn't be able to stand that rigour of being able to walk into a courtroom and say what has happened to them, and stand the cross-examination of that as well. Fortunately, what was happening at the point that the report went in, saying it's feasible, it's viable, we can expand it to be beyond children, is that this piece of legislation was already on its way to enactment, the Youth Justice Criminal Evidence Act. If you were to look at that piece of legislation, the bulk of it is about the prosecution of youth offenders. So that's mainly what that whole legislation is about. So what happened, I don't know if you know how legislation works, but what happened is the Justice Report became a bill, and they actually piggybacked it onto this legislation. So it went through fairly quickly, and it was a sea change. We have never in UK legislation had any law that's told the police how to gather evidence from a witness. Ever. And yet here we are now with a piece of legislation very early on that started to identify people as being vulnerable, and that we will start to do things quite differently. As you can imagine, to some police forces that did catch a lot of forces by surprise. It was one of those that will come eventually. I can remember having meetings with senior officers saying, when are we going to get all our interview suites up and ready, because this is coming. And it was all, yeah, it can come in, hang on. And then eventually it happened. We had no suites. We made an application to the Home Office for funding, and they said, well, we've already dished out the first lot of this, so we had to sort of sit and wait, as did some other forces. We were pretty shocked that it happened so quickly. So what does this part 2 of this legislation say? Well, one of the sections within it, section 16.1 of that Act, says that all children, and that's anybody under 18, is classed as vulnerable. So it doesn't matter anything else about them, they are classed as a child. And that's pretty much for all legislation when it comes to children. The definition is that under 18 you're vulnerable. But that is quite important to us. But this was the stuff that was introduced that we'd never had before. This second part of that section 16. It says that, well, if you're an adult, but you are classed as vulnerable, if the quality of your evidence is likely to be diminished because you're suffering from some a mental disorder, and they don't define that, they merely say as per the Mental Health Act. If you've looked at the Mental Health Act, It basically covers things like bipolar affective disorder, schizophrenia, the stuff that people will probably recognise as a mental disorder, anxiety, depression. But if you've got a mental disorder that can't be defined, then it's in there as well, because he says, and anything else. So the Mental Health Act covers actually all of us at any point that we may have some kind of a mental health problem. But it says, or otherwise, a significant impairment of intelligence and social functioning. So it's talking about you have something, whether it's a mental health illness or an impairment of intelligence or social functioning, but it's affecting your communication. So it's stopping you being able to be somebody who could give a statement to the police and then be able to walk into a courtroom and give that evidence. Now, if anyone's been to court, other than the police officers, it's quite a nerve-wracking thing to walk into a courtroom if you haven't got any kind of mental ill health or any kind of impairment of intelligence. So it's already, I'm nervous now stood in front of you, eventually I'll sort of settle down a bit, but already I've heard myself stumble over a few words because of the nerves of it. That's the nature of standing in front of people, which is what a courtroom is, and wanting to say what's happened, but not wanting to stumble over the words. Imagine having a mental ill health or some kind of impairment of your intelligence, and how much more stress that would affect. At some point, I know I'm going to settle down. It's probably when I'm on the train going home. But I know I will. Whereas that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a child, is it? Can you imagine a child? And when I say child, it's not just, don't think of just young children. It's any age under that 18. It's a nerve-wracking event. It also covers if you've got a physical disability or you're suffering from a physical disorder. So the person I like to bring into the room and talk about is Professor Stephen Hawkins. Because, quite frankly, he's the man who's got the brain the size of a planet. But he has a physical disability when it comes to communicating. Although we watch him on television and we listen to him communicating, that isn't how it works. Professor Stephen Hawkins has all his questions fielded to him days, weeks before, so that those answers can come out how they look like coming out. It's not a question-answer process. So could he walk in from? Could he go into a courtroom and give his evidence and be cross-examined in lifetime? No, he couldn't. So therefore he falls under this. So it's not always about intelligence. It's also about you may have some kind of a physical disability that stops you being able to walk into that courtroom and give your evidence. So that was the sea change that came about when this legislation was introduced. So on the back of the legislation, a document was created. It's the Ministry of Justice now that governs that document. We are currently on its 2011 edition, and it's called Achieving Best Evidence in Criminal Proceedings, Guidance of Vulnerable or Intimidated Witnesses, including Children. A really, really catchy title for a document. You can internet that. You can go on the Ministry of Justice website and you can look at that. It's a public document. It's not something that you'd read from start to finish. It's a document that you dip in and out of. Usually when I get police officers asking me questions about what if this, what if that, my first question to them is, what does the guidance say? Because it's a really comprehensive document that covers lots of aspects of if the police or social services had to do an interview with somebody vulnerable. This is the guidance that will help you to achieve best evidence. So on that document, it talks about practical issues, initial contact with the witness. Do we need consent? I don't know, what do you think? Do you think the police would need consent to interview a child? Do you think? Because the guidance and the legislation says no, we don't. Does anyone know why it actively says we don't need consent? Does anyone know why?
The child can't give it.
Some can. Yeah, some can give consent. But would you think a 5-year-old would give consent to being interviewed? And yet we don't need their parents' consent to interview them. Does anyone has a big guess as to why?
If they are victims of the parents, how do you know?
Yeah.
If you ask consent to the parents.
So the crime is interfamilial. So the parents can be the offenders. So it actively says, and it's a bit bizarre because that child we could interview without the parents' consent because we might be investigating the parents. But bizarrely, we do need the parents' consent to physically examine the child, which is a bit, because it's an intrusive thing to do to a child. So it covers all aspects of interviewing children, children's disability, children who are psychologically disturbed. I come from the force, South Yorkshire Police, pulled down lots of things about South Yorkshire Police over the most recent years. We've got a new chief constable who tells us that we're going to be the best force going in 5 years' time because we're sort of being attacked a lot through a lot of the media, one of them being the Rotherham child sexual exploitation. Very few people talk about the Rochdale and the Oxford, but it was the Rotherham that got highlighted, and that was one of the areas that we got wrong. We didn't really acknowledge that the psychological damage that was happening to some of those now women affected their communication, and we didn't consider how to get their best evidence. We didn't consider what grooming does to somebody. It talks about special measures because the legislation talks about this word, special measures. It's a legal word, and it talks about that there's provisions for vulnerable and intimidated witnesses, but I'm going to concentrate on vulnerable, to be able to give their best evidence in court. So in other words, it's no good me being able to video a child if I can't get that video into a courtroom. It would be pointless doing it. Now, in the 1980s, that was the memorandum on the back of the Cleveland inquiry, but now it's made it legislation. So it actually says in law that video, whether you're conducting that video under section 16.1 if it's a child, or section 16.2 it's somebody with a learning difficulty, in law that video is allowed to be adduced as the evidence in a courtroom. So it will be played rather than the child walking to the courtroom. In fact, the legislation says there is an assumption in law that a child will not walk into a courtroom to give their evidence. So, on the back of that, what are they, these special measures? Because there's lots of them. It's not just video interview. That's what I'm going to show you today. But there are lots of special measures. So the first one, it's a bit small, this book. For some reason it's got a bit skew with my PowerPoint. Screens. So section 23 of the legislation says that we can apply in a courtroom and put a screen across so the victim is in the witness box giving their evidence, but the defendant and the public gallery cannot see them. Who do you think would want that kind of special measure? So, what did you? Yeah, rape victim. Yeah, it's used a lot for rape victims, where they don't want the defendant to actually be looking at them and maybe boring their eyes into them. But the jury's got to be able to see that witness, because as we know, communication isn't just the words spoken, it's about how you present, it's about a jury is assessing the whole body, not just the words being said. So screens are a special measure that the Crown Prosecution Service would apply for before the trial. and would have to apply in front of a judge and say why they would want it. And then it becomes a decision with the judge as to whether it will be allowed. So screens are used quite a lot. Live link. So that's, of course, section 24 of this legislation says that a live link enables the witness to come to court, but sit in a room within the court and live link into the courtroom and give their evidence. So they're not in the courtroom, but they're in a room in the courtroom. Who would want that thing? Yeah, somebody might want to be able to actually give their evidence, but say that walking into a courtroom would perhaps stop me doing it because it's quite an intimidating place. So you might get maybe an older child who says, I'm prepared to come to court, but I'd like live link. Again, it's a special measure and it has to be applied for. And of course, when anything that's applied for, the defence can give a counter-argument to use it. Evidence in private is a special measure, section 25. That means that the public gallery is out. That is regularly used for any trial where children are involved. The public are not allowed to walk into those and watch those kind of cases. But courts are public events, so just about every other kind of case, the public do go. And there are people in all of the cities, Birmingham will be no different to Sheffield, where there are professional court attendants. They go with the sandwiches and their flats, and they go for a day out and sit in and have a look at what's happening in court, and they go and sit and that's their day, and they become really knowledgeable about court processes. And eventually, when they get really well known, they start to carry the judges' bags forward. And that's true, I do know somebody who did that. Removal of wigs and gowns by judges and barristers. So when would that happen, do you think? When would, sorry?
Small child.
Yeah, so children, that was on the back of the Thompson and Venables, the two young boys who killed Jamie Bulger. They took their case to the European Court of Justice on an unfair trial, that it was wigs and gowns, it looked like a very adult court. They were only 10 and 11, those two defendants, and would they have felt confident to have told their barrister something, that was happening in the trial, that maybe something wasn't right, when everything looked very theatrical, gowns, wigs, and they were just young boys on trial. What the European Court said was, yes, that wasn't a fair trial. It's got nothing to do with sentence, it's got nothing to do with any, it doesn't pay compensation, it basically puts the country on a